So I am the climate change project manager for the Nature Conservancy's Illinois chapter. And as Tom said, I'll be discussing an overview of the climate change work that we have planned here in Illinois for TNC. And first, I'm just going to take a second for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Nature Conservancy. We are a global environmental organization, and we work in every US state and 79 countries, and counting, seems to go up every day. TNC got its start in the 1950s as a land trust, and it has evolved and expanded over the years. Our work now still includes a strong focus on our original mission of land and water protection, but now also includes efforts to improve the sustainability of food production, building green cities, and tackling climate change, which will be the topic today. Our work on climate change is relatively new, but it is such a pressing issue, as was obvious in the last presentation, that it is now integrated across all of TNC's work. We have been working to identify how exactly TNC can engage on the issue of climate change in Illinois, trying to hone in on areas of work that best fit our niche. And since TNC is just one of many organizations working on climate change, we've tried to pay attention to our expertise and strengths to help guide our climate strategies and to make sure we are adding value. Our strategies are rooted in TNC's North American strategies for climate change, which I'm just going to go over briefly here. At the North American level on climate change, we're working in 4 main areas. The first focus is on using natural and working lands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is something we call natural climate solutions. Natural climate solutions include efforts to restore, conserve, and sustainably manage land in a way to maximize carbon storage and avoid emissions. The second focus is on an effort to build political support for climate action in the US. This strategy is focused on changing the politically divisive nature of climate change to build bipartisan support for climate change policy. And we're doing that by mobilizing new constituencies and directly trying to influence federal and state climate policy. Third, TNC is working to encourage renewable energy deployment at scale with a focus on efforts to shift renewable energy infrastructure to low impact sites where impacts to nature will be minimized. Finally, TNC is also working on climate adaptation. This work aims to mainstream natural infrastructure and the use of sustainable land management for adaptation and community resilience, specifically with a focus on drought, flooding, and extreme weather or storms, which are some of the biggest climate impacts we expect to see. So with TNC's overarching strategies in mind, we've identified the best ways to implement those here in Illinois. And I will briefly explain the areas of work we hope to focus on over the next few years. Our first strategy is focused on what I said were natural climate solutions, so encouraging the uptake of those here in Illinois. As I explained, natural climate solutions are any efforts to conserve, restore, and sustainably manage natural and agricultural landscapes in ways to avoid emissions and sequester emissions. In Illinois, the biggest low-cost opportunities for natural climate solutions happen to be in the agricultural sector, where the large-scale adoption of cover cropping and nutrient management could mitigate nearly 10 million tons of CO2 per year at current carbon prices. And that's equivalent to taking over 1 million cars off the road, so it is significant. And just to clarify, by large-scale adoption, I mean the use of cover cropping on roughly 2/3 of Illinois farmland, or about 15 million acres. So it certainly is an ambitious effort, but important. And these practices are already being employed by some farmers, but not at scale. Cover crops, for example, in Illinois are currently used on only about 3% of Illinois farmland, so there's a long way to go. Based on this information, it was clear that our work in Illinois on natural climate solutions should focus on trying to really push for increasing cover cropping and best practices for nitrogen management. In other areas of the country, it might be a focus on reforestation, for example, or protecting forests. But here, really the biggest opportunity is in the agricultural sector. So more specifically, our work will include establishing adequate baselines and mechanisms for tracking cover crops, creating policies and incentives to encourage uptake at scale, as there was a question for Jim in the last talk about how we really haven't seen uptake. So we really need those policies and incentives to try to get uptake at scale. And finally, providing direct support to farmers to start, to encourage them to really start using these practices. And then these are just a couple of charts to really show what the opportunity is and a little bit more of the background on how we identified this as a priority for Illinois. This is based on data from a study that TNC did a couple years back. And you can see from this map, at current carbon prices, which are about $10 a ton of carbon dioxide, Illinois ranks 4th in the nation in terms of scale of the opportunity for reducing emissions through natural climate solutions. And this is basically because, as you can see in this graph, the biggest opportunities for reducing emissions here, as I've explained, are through cover crops and nutrient management, which are 2 of the most cost-effective natural climate solutions, especially cover crops. So you can see here, at a price of $10 a ton, cover crops are pretty much by far the biggest opportunity we have here in the state. Moving on to the next strategy. This strategy is focused on building bipartisan support for climate change action. Given TNC's apolitical approach to conservation, we are well positioned to engage moderate to conservative groups on the topic of climate change and to encourage more ambitious bipartisan climate policy. And TNC is already working across all 50 states on this effort. So in Illinois, we are particularly well positioned to work with constituencies in the agricultural sector, owing to our experience and connections with communities across rural Illinois and the work we're already doing related to soil health and water quality. So we are looking for ways to leverage those relationships that we've established to mobilize the agricultural sector to support federal climate legislation. And our work on this will include developing assessments to better communicate the ecological and economic impacts of climate change to communities in rural Illinois. This has to do also with the question on improving science communication, trying to reach new audiences and motivate people. We'll also be integrating climate change messaging into existing outreach to farmers and grower groups and engaging our traditional agricultural partners in new ways. And then the second part of this strategy has to do with more direct outreach to federal and state policymakers. So we will also be trying to directly influence federal and state policy. At the federal level, we are trying to influence conservative members of Congress to support climate legislation with a long-term aim of supporting a price on carbon. At the state level, we are supporting the process of passing ambitious climate policy and working with the Climate Table, which is a state coalition of groups working currently on CEJA, which is the Clean Energy Jobs Act. Currently on hold, given the current situation, but we will be working on that moving forward. Then our third strategy is focused on the deployment of renewable energy and low impact siting. Obviously, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we really need to scale up renewable energy across the world. Illinois would be included in that need to vastly scale up renewable energy. Without careful planning, however, the deployment and the building of renewable energy projects can negatively impact natural areas and sensitive species. So from an environmental and social perspective, it is beneficial to prioritize how that renewable energy gets sited, trying to favor areas with the fewest adverse impacts to habitat, wildlife, and ecosystem services. And we'd like to see the state renewable deployment policies here in Illinois reflect that and preference project development on land with low habitat value and no significant adverse impacts to key species. In Illinois, this is a little bit different than if you're working in a state with more pristine natural habitat. We have a lot of farmland and converted land already, but it's still important to pay attention to. TNC has developed an interactive online map to help with this process called Site Wind Right. which is intended to help inform siting decisions. This map pulls from more than 100 data sets on things like wind resources, wildlife habitat, and current land use and infrastructure to help developers, in particular wind project developers, identify areas with the lowest potential for negative environmental impacts. And we plan, as part of our work on renewable deployment and siting here in the state, we plan to promote the use of tools like Site Wind Right, and we will also adapt TNC's low impact siting guidance for Illinois and hope to advocate to incorporate that kind of language within state clean energy policy, since currently there really isn't a lot of guidance at the state level on how to do this well.
Karen, you have about 4 minutes.
Okay, this is my last slide, so wrapping up here in a second. So finally, our fourth area of work is related to climate change adaptation. The first three were focused more on mitigation and trying to avoid climate change in the first place. But paying attention to the fact that we're already seeing changes, we also think it's important to work on climate change adaptation. And in Illinois, we have narrowed that down to a focus on reducing flood risk in urban and rural communities. As you saw in Jim's presentation, flooding and increased precipitation is something that we expect that we'll be dealing with more and more as a result of climate change. And really, flooding is one of the biggest risks that Illinois communities face with regard to climate change. And it is just expected to exacerbate the challenges that communities in Illinois are really already facing. In 2019, which was the second wettest and second hottest year on record for the US, 19 million acres of cropland went unplanted due to heavy precipitation and flooding across the Midwest. And then in Illinois specifically, flooding caused $3 billion in property damages between 2000 and 2018. So it's already an issue and expected to get worse. And so we're trying to think about ways that we can help ameliorate those impacts. And we at TNC think that as flooding increases, nature can really be used as an important and cost-effective tool for communities to enhance resiliency. In rural areas in particular, land use planning can help prioritize areas for floodplain restoration and reconnection, which is an excellent way to increase flood storage and decrease flood risk to infrastructure and communities. And then in towns and cities, natural infrastructure in the form of bioswales, rain gardens, tree planting is a low cost and effective approach for tackling issues like localized flooding, urban heat islands, and things like poor air quality. So we would like to expand our work in climate adaptation, which is somewhat new for us, and improve our impact across more communities throughout the state. So that's an overview of the four main strategies that we hope to work on with regard to climate change. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions if there's any time.
Thank you, Karen. I think there was a lot of interesting information in there. Doug, we'll take, there's a few questions I know have already come in. A reminder, there's a Q&A button on the lower part of your screen if you want to ask a question. And I'll turn things over to Doug right now to moderate the questions.
Thanks, Karen. Couple questions. One is, would you provide additional info about the engagement of the agricultural community through evidence-based information? Is that strategy effective for accomplishing those goals?
That's an excellent question. I think there's no doubt that engaging what tend to be more conservative and moderate groups, there is no great playbook for that. So I couldn't swear on any strategy, but I would say that what we have found in our information from our communications and marketing department is that the more localized the information is, the more people respond to it. And that especially information from local universities. So for example, in Illinois, hearing from U of I or U of I Extension versus hearing from Purdue, where they already have some great information out there that probably is very similar, would be more effective. So that's what we are really trying to think through, how we can localize that information, even down to the county level in some of the data, but at least down to the Illinois level, northern, central, and southern regions, to help people start to think about it in terms of their own experience and their own future. So I think that's the best we can do for now, but there is some proof that localizing the information does help.
Good. Here's a question about wind farms. The inquirer says wind farms could be a good thing, except they've often been designed as disposable with lots of waste. How is the disposability, the waste produced by wind turbines figuring into the talking about the future of wind energy?
You know, that is a question that is out of my area of expertise, but I will say that according to, you know, say EPA data or the overall life cycle analyses of different forms of energy, say natural gas versus wind versus solar versus coal, if you look at the life cycle analysis, which does take into account that waste, wind still far outperforms fossil fuels. So there is no doubt one of my pet interests is definitely minimizing waste and waste management systems. But so there is always room for improvement on that. And I do, like I said, not an expert, but there is still no doubt that even considering that waste, it is a preferential option for as a climate strategy.
Excellent. Here's one that I bet it will be easy. Someone asks, how do we access the site wind right map?
Oh, you know, I can pull up the, it's very easy. You could just Google site wind right Nature Conservancy and it will pop up. And I can also put it in the, well, I don't know if there is a chat function. Are people using the chat? I can also put it in the chat after this.
Yeah, we have that shut off, but if we can get that address during the next break, we could post that. We'd be happy to do, Tom would be happy to do that.
Okay. Yeah, for now, I will say it comes right up if you just go Google Nature Conservancy site wind right. But there is an online tool which is free. It uses GIS and the data is free to download as far as I know. So it is a useful tool. It's not the only tool that should be used when planning a wind farm, but it is one helpful tool to help people think through avoiding the worst impacts to habitats and species.
Sure, good. Have you considered precision ag as a strategy to help provide year-round land cover in places, reduce erosion, and provide flood reduction?
You know, this would be a much better question for our Director of Agriculture. So I'm going to have to just defer. I mean, to the extent we are working on improving soil health practices, I think precision ag comes into consideration. And obviously, we would love to see more year-round cover. So that is most definitely something we would support. But with regard to precision ag specifically, it's definitely outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, next question. Can you share strategies for state and federal agencies in the Midwest regarding siting of renewables while balancing corridors for biodiversity and the elegance or clunkiness of policy?
Let's see if I understood that exactly. I'm not, well, I will say one thing that we are working on, TNC at the national level has already developed baseline guidance. And what I'm working on right now is trying to adapt that into guidance for the state. It depends on if it's wind versus solar. Wind, for wind, we have the site wind right map, which really is trying to identify that kind of wildlife corridor and avoid it. In particular in Illinois, along the Illinois River, that's a huge corridor. And so the site wind right map eliminates the buffer along the Illinois River from siting wind. And then similarly, areas where there are major bat roosts, avoiding that is important, and the site wind right map identifies that. So I would say for wind, that step, using that map, and then also following the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services wind energy guidelines is also very critical for development. Solar, I mean, really you want to see it preferenced on rooftops, parking lots, degraded lands, brownfields, before you ever really see solar getting deployed at utility scale on certainly native habitat, but even farmland, which is quite, you know, our farmland is prime here. So we want to still protect that too. But Yes, we are working to provide some of that guidance in a more written, easily digestible format. So happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk about that offline.
All right.
Excellent. We had a few more questions, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll turn it back over to Tom.